So thank you very much for being here. Welcome to the first event of the Explorers in 2023. Today we are up for a treat. Our guest is Thomas Cauvin, who actually appointed me as the project manager of the Explorers in 2018. It's really great to have him with us today, and we are very grateful that he accepted the invitation. Let me say a little bit about Thomas. He's the head of the Department of Public History at University of Luxembourg's Center for Contemporary and Digital History, which he joined in 2020 in the framework of his ATTRACT Fellowship. Thomas was also the president for the International Federation for Public History from 2018 until 2021. In May-June 2022, Thomas launched the second edition of his book, Public History, a Textbook of Practice with Routledge. The book explores opportunities and challenges encountered by public history practitioners in the field. 6 years after the first edition, renewed attention is given to the increasingly international dimension of public history, its fast-changing digital practices, and the renewed debates of what it means to work for, on, with, and among. We hope you enjoy today's Explorers. Please remember to silence your mics while the speaker is making his presentation, but you can use the chat at any time. And after Thomas finishes his presentation, you can open your mics and we can start our discussion and Q&A. Thank you, Thomas, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jimena. I will share my PowerPoint. Could you let me know if you see my slides? Jimena, if you just nod, I will see.
Yes.
Okay, lovely. Well, first of all, thank you, Jimena, not only for inviting me today, but also for having done an incredible work through the International Federation for Public History, and especially through the Explorers. I didn't really appoint you in 2018. You volunteered, well, and but you've done a great work. And the Explorers, I think, were created in 2016, something like this. And it's amazing how, I mean, to see them now, the network, the number of people, the number of talks that you do. It's very impressive, and so I'd like to thank you for that, Jimena.
Thank you.
You asked me to present a bit of the textbook that I wrote and published 2022, and I think through that, what I want to do is not really about the book, but it's about what practices do we do through public history, not only what is public history, but the different approaches of public history. Maybe something also about training and teaching, because the textbook is mostly to teach. So why do we need public history teaching? What could that be? And we'll hopefully finish with a few examples of teaching, not only through the textbook, but it's connected to the book. So I hope that sounds okay. I will not look at the chat while I'm talking. I'm very bad at multitasking, but feel free to write your comments in the chat and I will look at them afterwards. All right, so Public History, a Textbook of Practice, a little bit of context first, trying to see. So it's a book, it's a long history. When I first started to write a textbook, and that's the second edition. So the first edition was published in 2016, and I started to work on the book in 2014. And by then, there was no textbook. There were some collections of essays about public history, but they were more like collections of essays. So gathering resources and chapters from different authors, different parts. And now, today, you see a few textbooks, you see handbook, companions. So it's been a very rich, well, a rich market. So you see textbook in different languages too. So that was, I think that's good. That means that the field is active. So I published the first textbook in 2016, and Routledge asked me to do a second edition for 2021, 2022, based on feedback and reviews that we have received from authors using the textbook, and also reviews published about the textbook and my simple feedback about using my textbook and what worked and what worked less. So we well, I started to work on the second edition in 2021. And at first I thought it would be like a second edition. So, you tweak a few things, you add a few things, and you think that's going to be fine. But it turned out that the work was much more important than I expected. And I'm going to try to explain why. So also, why a textbook? I still remember the head of my department, and Megan, you know him, in 2014, when I told him that I'm gonna write a textbook. He said, well, it's not possible. You can't write a textbook on public history. And his arguments were not devoid of interest, but like the field is too broad, right? There are too many resources, too many subfields, and it's very hard to discuss what the common threads in public history are. So you feel, well, it's not possible, at least not for one author. I still tried and gave my best, but I really think it's challenging to write textbooks in public history. First, because one author, really, can only one author pretend to write a book about public history, a field that has been, made with different approaches, different practices. So is that possible? Second, encompassing. Is there a book in public history that encompasses all the practices? Obviously, no, but it doesn't mean that we can't give an overview of what the field is. And the third challenge is something that Routledge was very keen in developing, especially for the second edition, is to be even more international. So not only about public history as a rich field of practices and theories, but also being more international. So public histories, and what does public history mean in different parts of the world, and what are the different practices, understanding, and so on. So I've tried to combine that in the new edition, and I think the second edition is much less a collection of resources, which was very much how I've designed the first edition, because I was relatively new to the field. So looking at what different people do in oral history, in historic preservation, public archaeology. In 22, I think I'm more confident in providing my own understanding of public history. So I think there is more coherence in the second edition than the first edition, which is pretty normal, given that my understanding has changed. So why a textbook, but why public history training per se, right? I think we are all convinced here that we need public history training, but not everybody is. Right? So usually my arguments for public history training is that it's not because you're a good researcher that you're a good teacher, right? And if you have been teaching, you may very well know that it can be very painful because you think you know your stuff, and delivering your stuff to children who may have no interest in history or may not even pay attention can be very painful. It's the same thing with public history. It's not because you know your stuff. It's not because you're a good researcher, knows your archives, that you're communicating very well or collaborating very well with people, right? We all have this cliche of, historians isolated from their partners, working in the archives, publishing, but not being good at communicating or engaging with people. It's a cliche, but I think that tells us that we need to learn some skills to practice public history. And also because we have more and more careers, not existing careers because they were there before, but careers accessible to people who have a history degree. So we need to learn public history, we need to practice public history. And I also think that public history can be super useful for just, history major students who do not want to practice public history, but they need to know about, public history debates or public debates about the past, public debates about monuments, public debates about TV shows, films. So how the past is discussed in the public space is also something that I believe can be in public history training. So those are some arguments, and I'm sure you have others. I'd be very keen in learning and listening to your arguments about why we need public history training. Also because doing the transition with skills, and you can see here some graph and some figures about a survey that the National Council on Public History did a few years ago about public history employers and what are they looking for when they hire public history candidates. And you have some skills there that they have identified. Obviously, you have historical research on your left as part of the skills that we expect from public history candidates or people who will perform public history in archives, museums, guided tour, and so on. But you have other skills like public speaking, project management, and public speaking is actually something very, very underestimated in history training, because history training is mostly done through written assignments, whereas public speaking is considered more like a hobby or the presentation that you do at the end of the semester, right? And on the opposite, I do think that all public speaking is super important to engage and to communicate, obviously, with different partners, different publics. On the right-hand side, you see another survey about what will be the skills in the future based on that same survey. And you see that fundraising, digital media, project management are the top three. And it's not surprising if fundraising is top one, and even more since, I think, COVID and the need to diversify your finances. So that means that on top of being a good historian, you may have to learn skills like fundraising or podcasting or project management and team working in teams. So those are some skills that I believe belong to public history. Right now, how does that impact, or how does that affect the book? The first image that I want to show you is the cover, because it took me some time to come up with a cover that I liked. And the reason I chose that one was for this mosaic kind of feeling, because that's very much how many people see public history, as a mosaic of different practices, right? John Dadone has mentioned public history as an umbrella. I'm going to use it as a metaphor, but you see public history as a set of different practices. So here you see historic preservation, monuments, podcasting, historic preservation through landscape, preserving landscape, historical landscape, or archiving, public harvest. Megan, you can see two pictures from Louisiana here with the harvest in the public library in Lafayette, and one picture at Vermilionville as well. So a set of practices, and I think that was the feeling that I wanted to give through the book. Now, how do I define the public history in the book? And I first would like to take some time to discuss the first part of the book. The first part of the book is basically the big issues in public history, and you see five, and I've added a few. So defining public history is not, the word is defining, not a definition, right? Because I don't think it's very useful to have one specific definition of public history. It's very difficult, but defining public history and the different issues, the different thread, the different topics can be quite useful. The second part is about a long history of public history, and instead of simply saying that public history was born in 1975 in California, when they used for the first time public history as an expression, going back in time and see what are the roots of public history, not only in the US, but also internationally. The third part was something that didn't exist in the first edition, like internationalization of public history. What does that mean? What is it, right? What are the new definitions of public history in Indonesia, in Brazil, right? And how do these definitions help us together to have a more find a more nuanced definition or approach of public history? And the two other chapters in that introduction are two key topics, key practices. One is working with, right? What does that mean to collaborate? What does that mean to share authority? So this is some reflection about what sharing authority means and the relation between sharing authority and expertise in the book. And I will spend the last part of this presentation talking about working with and what that means. And last but not least in this introduction, the rise of digital public history. Because digital public history is way more present today than it was in 2016. It was there, but it's even more present today. So I'm presenting a few practices and a few theories of what that means to do a user-generated public history. So defining public history by its core issues, its core practices, and its history. But it's not enough. I think in the book also is trying to theorize a bit the field of public history, and that's when I came up with that metaphor of public history as being a public history as a system, interconnected system. So it's not a one line street. It's not bottom up. It's not top down. It's a connected system of a tree. And I'm gonna explain what I mean by the different parts and how they reflect in the book. The first part, or one part of the tree, is about the roots. And the roots is about the creation and the management of sources, primary sources. So you see there archives, but also the preservation of sites, objects, digital born topics, or history. So that's when you create sources, when you manage sources. And that reflects in the book with the second part, which is about public history and sources. What are the sources in public history? But even more important, how do we create, maintain, preserve public history sources? So you have articles, chapters about museums, for example, a new part on decolonizing museums. You see a part on archiving, very important about silences, right? What is silent through archive, but also through our work, right? Who is not present in our project? Whom are we silencing? So I think this part of archiving is very important in public history. Historic preservation and, for example, the competing uses of historic sites. That's what happens when you collaborate or you have competing understanding or competing needs, right? What do you do with the building? Do you restore the building? Do you reuse the building? So some of the discussions and debates in historic preservation. So unlike the first edition, in which I was way more talking and writing about facts, so basically how do you launch a section 106 survey, this is more now about debates and topics that we have been discussing. So less how to do things and more about what are we doing and why. And the last chapter was about oral history. It's still about oral history with some topics like subjectivity from narrators, right? How do we cope? How do we deal with the subjectivity aspect of collecting memories and testimonies? So those are the roots, the sources. Then I evolve into the second part, which is more about the branches. So it's basically, for lack of a better word, communicating history to various types of audience, right? So you see, and Danny will be here to see video game, but it's also about social media, exhibition, podcast, radio. And I do believe that the more media you can use, control, mobilize, the broader your audience, our audience will be. So that translates into the book with basically chapters about making public history, communicating history. So it could be about the different levels of public history writing, because you have to be able to write an academic article, but also to write text panel for a museum, or you may have to, right? So the different types of writing and how to apply that in your teaching and your training. Then a new chapter that I added because of the public debates on fiction. I was inspired by the crowd, so the Netflix TV show, and how this triggered discussion among public history students about not only what is fiction, but how fiction can be used and be useful in public history. So that's a brand new chapter that I included in the book. Then you had radio and audiovisual production. I think what is new here in the last few years is the rise of podcasting as a way to reach non-academic audiences. Academic audiences as well, but also non-academic audiences. Then exhibiting history and immersion and performance. The last one on performance is also part of MEUR, especially with the gamification and not only video games, but gamification in general, and how we can learn in public history from game studies and game experts. So this was about the making and communicating public history. And finally, public history is about the leaves. So the different uses, competing uses that you do or that people connect to public history. So that could be tourism, that could be politics, marketing, identity, education, and so on and so on. So the multiple uses of history in the public space or by public groups that triggers sometimes some conflict. So this translates into the final part of the book, which is about developing public history teaching, but also working with underrepresented groups and communities, for example. The rise, not the rise, but the increasing discussion that we have, especially with Tanya Evans and other colleagues from the UK about family history and how family historians help develop public history. And the two final chapters about conflicting and competing narratives, because the more you open the framework to different groups, to different partners, to different views, the more chance you have to get competing narratives, right? And that's one of the objectives of public history. So how to deal with conflicting public narratives, and how does that deal with reconciliation and sometimes censorship from different political structures. And the final chapter is about basically consulting, which is, as I understand, a very North American, maybe Anglo-Saxon type of practice, way more developed in Northern America than in Europe, for example, historian as consultant. But that's something important that I didn't want to leave out in the book. So that gives you an idea of the different chapters, but I think the main idea for me in the book and in public history is to make history more public. So to make history more accessible by different publics, more engaging, more participatory, more inclusive, more connected, because public history, I think, and that's the point at the bottom, gathers people, right? When we talk about public history, when we practice public history, we gather people who have different expertise. We gather people who are historians, but not historians, media experts, groups, associations, decision makers. I think that's one of the main assets of public history, to have this capacity to gather people who may not have met without this focus on making history more accessible. And one of the paradoxes of public history is that most of people who talk about public history are people from academia. And the whole point of public history was to connect history with non-academic partners. So I think that's one of the tension of public history. And I think it's very important not to oppose public history and academic history. There are some differences, but there's not a strict opposition between public and academic history, because if we mean academic research, right, we need academic research to do public history. But we can't really put a limit between public and academic history. When do you become a public history practitioner? Is that when you go on radio and talk about your work? Is that because you're consulting for an exhibition? There's no straight line. So instead of working about two worlds, I prefer to think in terms of levels. Our projects are more or less accessible to the public. Our projects are more or less inclusive. Our projects are more or less participatory. So in that sense, you could say that everything can be public history, but it's more or less public. There's no, on one hand, academic historian, on the other hand, public historians. That's not how I conceive the field. But for me, again, practicing public history is key. Making making and connecting, making history more accessible, making history more participatory, connecting different partners, gathering people from different fields and different types of expertise is, I think, at least for me, one of the main assets of doing public history. So what has changed in the last few years, and I've, with a spelling on public history, misspelling, the field is changing because of its international dimension. And Jimena is a very good example and also proponent to that. Making history more international brings more nuances, more different approaches, maybe even more reflective. Because when you talk to colleagues from South Africa and they mention applied history and they say, well, what's different between applied history and your vision of public history? We need to reflect about what the key issues and the key practices in the field are. So it forces us to be more reflective. What has changed, as I've mentioned before, is also that public history is more digital than it used to be. All right, problem with my screen. So new chapters that are now present in the book. Right. So now the second part, I'd like to talk a bit about teaching and how I connect the textbook with teaching public history. And the first thing is that teaching public history does not only take place in academic circles. I wouldn't say that most, but a lot of people practice public history, learn public history outside of university, right? But I'm gonna explain a few of the points that I develop in the book. Theory and practice, I think that's very obvious in public history. There's no such thing as a clear division between theory and practice. It has to be about both the theory and practice, and not undermine historical methodology. I've seen some programs or even training when there is no courses about historical methodology, for example, right? And I think there's a risk of focusing too much on communicating history or project management if you don't have the skills to perform or do yourself a good historical research. To do that, I really like to have project-based learning, right? We have a project, team-based, in which we can include different partners to perform public history together. I think that's one of the common aspects of public history training, and the textbook is similarly focusing on how projects can help us learn to do public history. And as I said, learning in the field, a lot of public history is learned in the field through internship, but not only. Through projects or learning to perform and do public history, and if you want, then get an academic degree. That's also very possible. But the clear distinction between university learning and non-university learning is, I don't think, valid. Gonna move slightly faster on that. Right. Now, a few examples of what that means concretely when you want to teach public history, or when you want to help your students to make history more accessible to non-experts. I'm going to present just one project that I very like. It's about podcasting, teaching students how to podcast their research. That means first that they have to do some research using and working with primary sources, but they have to learn new skills, or they have to develop new skills like oral and public skills. Right? How do you speak? How do you deliver your research with a microphone, which is very different than writing an essay? Interviewing skills, editing skills, working on copyright, which is a very important skill in public history. Can you use that document, right? And knowing what you can use and not use. Script writing. I like podcasting because students have to write a script. And a script is not an essay, right? If you ask them, well, the French influence in the American Revolution, they can write an essay, okay, 5-6 pages. If they need to write, or if they need to produce a podcast about the very same topic, the writing is very different, right? They have to write a script, and that's very, very difficult. Just to give you an example of script writing, they write a few drafts, usually between 3 and 5 drafts for one script. And you can't write a script for a podcast as you write an essay, obviously, right? That's obvious, but in many ways, students have to unlearn the academic writing that they have learned over the years. They will not forget it because they can still use academic writing in other courses or writing, publishing stuff, but they have to unlearn part of that if they want to write a good podcast. So, and I think this is a very accessible type of medium using podcast. There are many platforms, free access, open access platforms. That's the one I'm using, Anchor on the right. And usually students like it because first, they have something in the end that they can use, you know, their CV and their resume. So something they can share with their friends, with their family, and they can listen to each other, and they have this feeling of leaving the class with something tangible, which is obviously always the case, but they usually like this practice-oriented and project-based learning. The other activity that I connect to the book is creating short documentary film. And the skills that they have to learn, and it's in the chapter on documentary film, is again storytelling and writing script for a video, but also about the role and the communication of primary sources on screen, because obviously you can't use text on screen as you do in an essay with footnotes. So you have to adapt your research and find very specific documents, interviewing people, finding visual documents, because again, you can't really use too many texts. So that makes them think about the relation between archives and communication of history and how the medium affects the research that you do. And from that, we can learn from specialists in media studies, documentary film. Why do you want to shoot your interview on site? This is Ken Bird interviewing for the Civil War documentary. Why does he interview that person here? Because that's where things took place in the 19th century. So you have this question of authenticity that you need to convey in documentary films that you may not have to do in an essay. So they have to learn skill. They also have to think about what they're doing and the impact of the practice on history. So I will not go into details about the different documentary films they have produced, but that's one of my preferred classes. And I think that's also one of the students' favorite class in which they can, at the end, show, and we have a public showing of their documentary film to their parents, to their friends, and so on. Right, so those are some teaching practices, but I also think that the book and public history in general connects with very important theories in the field. So I will not have too much time to go through all the slides, and you have here just some of the main debates in the field about activism. Activism has been very, very big lately. How does that affect public history, right? And in Europe, it's sometimes difficult to explain the benefit of activism and what activism in public history, because I believe that public history in Europe is a little bit more cautious with activism, but that's a very important debate to have. So what I want to do well, if you give me 10 more minutes, Jimena, that's the thing I will discuss. Working with publics. So the type of questions that I share in the textbook about working with different publics, plural, why and what that means. Why? Because Michael French would say you share authority because his authority is shared by definition, right? So it's not something you decide to do. Authority is shared. So if authority is shared by definition, well, cope with that, deal with that. And to be honest, Michael Frisch was is still very much inspired by oral history and a shared authority. So authority is shared between the interviewee and the interviewer, as in the document. By definition, yes. The two people make history together with different roles, but they make history together. It's slightly more challenging when you try to translate that into exhibition, for example, or archiving, right? What's the shared authority in museums and archives? But people who say, well, you share authority not because you have to, but also because it brings what that person expressed in this on this website from India. It's a public history master program. He says, we belong to that very India, which finds no place in the textbooks of history. The argument is that working with people helps make history and historical narratives broader, richer, and more nuanced. And it's not a new topic. If you read this wonderful book by Michel Rolfe-Trudeau on silencing the past, it is all about how our choices and the actors of the event, but also the archivists, for example, select the past, right? Choose the past, and by choosing, you silence, right? That's the principle of selecting. So I think the concept of a shared authority, of working with people, forces us to think about who's in the picture and who is not, who's represented, who's not, whose historical interpretation is or is not part of the public history process. And I think, again, it's been very big in the museum are not neutral debates. But the same thing with archives, decolonizing archives. What does that mean? It means that you have a colonial structure in the archiving process, right? So at least public history is not the magic wand. We won't solve everything, but it forces us to think about what is public in the history making. And I think if we already think about that, that's already success. But still, many colleagues, or some colleagues, who say, well, I don't want to share authority with people who have very little knowledge about the topic. I got a PhD in this. Why should I share authority with people who have opinions, right? That's a fair point. And it's a very difficult discussion. But I think first there's a misunderstanding. Authority is not expertise. Authority is about power, control, decision-making, who decides in the project, the title, for example, of an exhibition, right? Sharing authority forces us to think about who can take part in that process, right? It's about power, control, not controlling the very end result, which is one of the definitions of shared authority. Expertise is not about control. Expertise is about who can do what, right? Skills, knowledge, and it's quite different. So you may have an expertise and not being part of the decision-making, or you may be part of the decision-making and have no expertise. So I think we should distinguish between the two, because then you can open up the process of control with different types of expertise involved. Let me give you just one example. Expertise. Historians have expertise, right? Some students ask me, why should I bother to get a history degree if anyone can do history? So historians, university historians, but other professional historians in archives, different types of, they have expertise, right? They know stuff, they have a methodology, and that's very important, right? You have a couple of articles and examples about, we need historians to be part of public history because they can bring this and that. So I think it's fair to say that historians have expertise, but they don't have the monopoly of authority, and that's the difference. Because again, we can learn from different field, museum studies, urban policy, in the sense that participation is a very broad concept, right? But we have different steps. Not everything is participatory, and not every step is participatory. For example, in your museum, you can do a participatory collecting. It doesn't mean that you have to do participatory text writing, right? So if we deconstruct participation into different steps, then we can have steps that are more or less participatory and find people who are more or less equipped to do those steps. Not everybody can do everything. I think that would be very naive to pretend that everybody can do everything. So if we are honest with the process, some people can do things and can contribute to the process. Some people can transcribe public history. This is one example, Transcribe Bentham, a very famous crowdsourcing project in which people transcribe archives. Okay, that's one skill. But can we go further? Can we have people, non-professional, becoming what the 1947 archive, partition archive in India, Pakistan, say citizen historians? Can people take part in the interviewing of witnesses? Can they become citizen historians? And I think that's where the main debates are today. Can people participate in more than just transcribing text? And I would say yes, going back to what we talk about, sharing authority and combined expertise. We work with different people with different expertise. If you're, let's say, an academic historian and you are asked to be consultant for an exhibition on the history of slavery in Liverpool in a museum. As an historian, you're going to have to work with the collection manager, with the curator, and they will probably say that your text is too long for once. You also have to work with the marketing officer, so you share authority with people who have different expertise anyway. In public history, it's pretty much the same. In addition to that, you accept that some people may have living expertise, right? They have been living in the same neighborhood for their whole life. They know about the neighborhood. It doesn't mean that it's always true what they say, but they have an expertise, right? This is an example of the museum in Chicago in which you have a combined expertise between a collection manager and a representative of one of the local indigenous tribe. And together, they try to uncover the meaning of that artifact and how that artifact can be displayed in an exhibition. So it's an example of combined expertise, right? Share authority, yes, with different expertise, living expertise, traditional expertise, collection manager, and material culture expertise. So that's something I'm trying to develop through the book, but also in my project. And I will finish with that. It is so far a quite optimistic vision of public history, but we know that sometimes, often, some people, groups abuse history. There is no lack of example of propaganda, censorship, threat, people being threatened for doing history. There are many examples from all over the world, so I'm not going to quote one country here also. What can we do? Well, first, it's not new. And second, public history is not a magic wand, right? So the question is, can public history solve propaganda? No, obviously not. So that's not how we should address the question. What I think we can do is that we, and by we, I'm saying trained historians, but public history practitioners in general, we can be better at communicating history, learning skills to make history more accessible, open access, for example, clear, jargon-free, for example, so to make our work better, to be better at collaborating between university, research center, cultural institution, media groups, associations, about publics, framing, creating frameworks that make inclusive interpretation of the past possible. So working better together. I think this could help not only erasing propaganda, but being stronger in the public space. One voice only is nothing, but working together at communicating with different groups, with the support of institutions and so on, can make public history more present in the public space. Because again, if you Google or if you discuss any topic about the past, you will have opinion, you will have a lot of discussion, but sometimes very little history, or at least history based on sources and some contextualization. So I think by doing a better about working together and communicating history, we can make a difference. So that's the final slide. Just to something that I like to share with my students at the end of the course. not all expertise are on the same levels, right? We can't expect everybody to have the same expertise, and we can't expect every steps to be fully participatory. Sometimes you know, people, groups, or institutions have to moderate. Again, not all interpretations are valid. It's not because it's public participation that everything is true, right? So this is something to be discussed with your partners. And I think the whole point of history, of public history, is maybe not to share the final product with different partners, but to share tools and methodology for people to contribute to public history. So not sharing the final product, but making the process of constructing history more engaging, more transparent, and more participatory. So this is how I will conclude my talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I open the floor for questions or comments from people in the audience, or if you just want to put them in the chat, I can also read them. I can start because I don't have more like a question, but as a comment. I work in the USA system and the tenure system, and I feel the tension because to be promoted in the tenure system, you have to produce academic tests. They have to be peer reviewed. They have to be like really academic. And when you produce other kind of texts that are not like that, like perhaps a blog post or something, they don't count. So it's always a tension there. And I think that's also a fight that public historians, we still have to do, because I mean, producing a blog post or something like that is still writing, and it's still an exercise. So I think that's a great point of the book. Chantal has a question. Chantal, go ahead.
Can I just say something
Yes.
before Chantal?
Yes.
Sorry, Chantal, yes. To react on what you just said. Yes, I think there is some, how do you say, hypocrisy in some academic circles in which they hire you for something and evaluate you for something else. Sometimes administration is very keen in developing public history because of the enlarging communities and the role of universities in the US and but they don't give you the credit for what you do, or they don't count it as either teaching or research or administration. And in my previous university, we had to fight to acknowledge that contributing to an exhibition should be part of your evaluation and your promotion. And the National Council of Public History has published a white paper, and I think together the networks of public history can convince our administration that this is valid history. There are some rules, for example, for reviews, and but this is part of our job. It's not the service part only that public history is. Sorry, Chantal.
No, you're welcome, of course. I've one informative question and one comment. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by decolonizing museum? That's the question. And the comment is a tension I feel more and more. In some way, sometimes the more you share your knowledge, your expertise, the more you lose control. That's interesting, but also on the same times, and that's the tension I feel, you are more and more contested as such. Just an example on colonialism, decolonialism, you feel people are very attached to their view, and they don't consider you anymore as an expert, and this goes sometimes parallel with the fact that you try to be more participative. So how to deal with this? That's it.
Thank you, Chantal. Two very good points. Let's start maybe with decolonization. Well, it's not new. I mean, there've been studies about decolonization or decolonizing museums, decolonizing archives. That's not new. I think, and you know way more than I do about the topic. We have proposed, and we're going to launch a working group at the National Council for Public History on that aspect of decolonizing through public history. And what we understood was that, well, first you have decolonizing institutions, so through collections, or even more important, through the process of changing the structure that sometimes reflect colonial structures. So, for example, we have people working in South Africa and in Brazil who will talk about what that means to contest the official structure of the museum and that support decolonization. But I think talking about international public history, there is also this, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's naive, but this idea that public history has a very Western definition and a very Western approach, even definition of public. If you talk with people in Japan or in China, or in Africa, in some country in Kenya, the definition of the public and what public institution means, for example, is very different. And I think in our talk, and myself first, because I'm part of that, we support a very Western understanding of what public means. And by decolonizing public history, we try to provide more inclusive framework in which, for example, colleagues from Kenya will help us to redevelop what public means. So this is another aspect of decolonizing history. And the last one is, can we decolonize through public history? This is a very, again, it's a question. Can participatory processes help decolonize structures? Right? So that's something that our colleagues in Brazil are very keen in developing, oral history and participatory public history, to challenge the official colonial structure. So those are very, I understand and I agree, very different understanding of decolonizing, but that's, I think, where the field could, I mean, the fields could go. Your second point, tension, is something I haven't thought much about, so thank you very much. Sometimes sharing, so if I understand you will, sometimes the more you make it participatory, the more you share, the less credible or legitimate you become, because people will. This is a very good point, and something that, again, some Brazilian colleagues express, saying that, oh, you're doing participatory public history with non-experts, so your work is not legit. Right. So that was used by Bolsonaro's supporter to discredit academic historians who work with different publics. Say, well, if you work with non-experts, with people who have no expertise, that tells a lot about your work. So I guess this can be an issue. And in some cases, but I also think that the opposite is damaging. Like, if you don't participate, is your voice and your project heard? Like, to give you an example, if you publish an article, that's fine. I mean, unless you're top and everybody will discuss your article. But if you work with, let's say, an archive, or if you work with a museum and you organize an exhibition, you may reach more people. And you can, your expertise and the trust that people bring or give to the museum can create something stronger. Like, you may have academic expertise, and the museum has this trust that people put in the museum. So together we can also think that you can be stronger, right? So I'm not saying that it's always the case, and I'm sure that people can discredit your work because you share authority with non-experts. I guess that may be a risk we have to take, but I would be very keen in developing more that example, because I think that could be something we should discuss.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. There are some comments and observations in the chat. Thomas, do you want me to read them for you, or do you want to address them?
Yes, if you could read them, that will give me some time to think about them.
So the first one is a comment from Danny. The situation is similar in Canada in terms of promotions. However, I'm seeing some change with research creation, though what scholar means by that tends to vary. My department is struggling with this very right now with our new research creation PhD stream. Then we have a comment also from Malena. She says, Malena Bedoya, in some Latin American countries, we no longer speak of the colonial, but of the anti-colonial. I think there are differences here that are now being used in the global south. Then we have a comment from Rob Townsend. Notable that the AHA recently issued guidelines to expand the definition of historical scholarship to include more public history work, and he provides the link. Thank you for that. But the whole subject is shaped by promotion and tenure concerns of academics. Then we have a comment also from Simina Badika. I need to leave, but thank you. Okay, and Rob Townsend. Is there some way to create a definition of expert history that recognizes public history workers as equal to or alongside academics?
Thank you, Rob. Danny, I think I'll go through each question at a time. Danny, I'm not completely sure I understand your point because it connected to something we were discussing, but since I don't know what we were discussing about, I'm not sure. Could you ask your question? Can you open your mic and ask your question again, Danny?
Yeah, I'll say it. I'm sorry if there's sound. I'm a very bad person, and I'm at the gym right now while listening to the academic stuff. Those who know me know. So basically, my point is when you were talking about the fact that like some work isn't necessarily recognized in terms of public history. Say you do a blog, say you have podcasts or whatever. They're not necessarily counted towards your promotion or as kind of the traditional type of work of like publishing books and articles and even ranking articles versus books and all that stuff, right? So I feel like there is some change happening, at least in my circles, when it comes to this idea of research creation, which you see a lot in other disciplines, but of course there's an overlap with public history in all the different projects we do. And there are some people working, of course, on trying to make like academic podcasts, for instance, in Canada. And then there's also just the greater idea of doing art, for instance, or in film studies, people making films, and all those different type of things. So I think there might be a link to do there if it's not already done. However, there's also a difficulty in defining what is precisely research creation, because at least in my case, I was actually thinking of going into the research creation stream, but because my work is more of kind of doing history and then communicating it, my department doesn't see that as research creation. They see that as just a kind of creative representation of history, which other scholars might actually see as a form of research creation. Like if I'd be creating a video game or creating a film, then yes, absolutely, they'd be entirely on board. But I'd need to like spend half of my time proving why I'm making a film or why I'm creating a video game for what I'm doing. That kind of half of my PhD research would be proving why I'm doing is important and relevant. So I feel there's still tensions there happening, but it was mostly a thought about how research creation and what's happening there might be an interesting kind of parallel struggle that public historians are also going.
No, I agree, Danny, and I feel fairly optimism in the trend, in the sense that it's more and more likely or acknowledged that non-academic publications can be part of the output. Obviously, depends your department, your institution, but the trend is mostly to acknowledge those different sort of output, right? The question then is becoming about, what is equal to one academic article and stuff like that. But without going into details about that, I think expanding the definition of what research output is can be important. There are other ways to, because one argument is say, well, academic peer review are peer review. When you do a podcast, it's not peer review, but there are ways to bypass that, talking about public reviews or impact as well. So I don't think we should talk about equality of production, because I think it's an endless debate, but opening up what counts as valid research and public history practices is widening, even in more conservative frameworks that I think European universities are. We see that happening slowly but surely. The next question was from Malena. Yes, very good point, Malena. That's why that's why the definition of public history and public in history has to be more inclusive, because just as you mentioned, instead of decolonial, anti-colonial, and that make everybody rethink about what the overall structure is about. So that's a good example of bringing more inclusive definition and understanding of public history. So yeah, I completely agree.
And then we have Rob Townsend.
Yeah.
And
yes, Rob, you're right. And the last guideline from IHA, is bringing this more diverse definition of what historical scholarship is. And I think that's why we need the IHA guideline, the NCPH reports, to convince our colleagues, our administration, and the people who have power in deciding about tenure and promotion that history goes beyond publication. But again, this is a very small part of the actors of public history. I mean, who cares about tenure and promotion? Only academics. In the outside of university, this is a detail, and the question is also for museums and archives and group association, why do we work together? Because sometimes not sharing authority comes from public groups. They don't want to share authority with you because they are the historical witness, they own the history. So the question is not only one-way street. It's not only, should historians share authority? And sometimes the question is not that, the question is people don't want to listen to you. If you go on social media, it's not about historians sharing authority, it's about people not accepting or not even discussing with liberals or elites. So I think it's a global, well, it's a broader question. I completely agree with you, we need that. And if we displace the discussion over the public space, then it's even more difficult on what good history is in the public sphere. And you also mentioned, Rob, is there some way to create a definition of expert history that recognizes public history workers as equal to alongside academics? I don't know if there is a way, but again, for, let's say, historians who work in museums, they would not see this as being not organized as much as academics. I agree with you that we could have a broader definition of public history workers, and that's why I try not to use public historians, because for me it's confusing. That means that you have public historians and others. I like to use instead public history practitioners who can be trained historians, but they can also be a podcaster, right? And you work together, two practitioners, to develop something that is more than one single work. So I like to use public history practitioners instead of public historians. And I'm not convinced by the amateur historian definition either. So, but that's a good question, Rob.
Then we have Jen Mironok. She has like a quite extensive entry. Jen, would you like to open the mic and give the comment?
Oh, hi. Thank you so much. I'm actually in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I actually work with Daniel Steinberg at the Princeton Center for Complex Materials, but specifically looking at STEM education. So the comment is that we're doing what I call scalable humanities. I come from tech. I moved into doing STEM education about 10 years ago. I actually work with Michael Frisch as well. He's one of my mentors and advisors. So what we're doing is we have a public history presentation that's 45 minutes, and it's paired with a local scientist, and we're recreating the speaking tours that Marie Curie did in the US in the 1920s. There were 2 of them. And what my question is because we're not commercial, we are humanities, you cannot purchase our production. This is not a purchase, this is not a product. This is an experience, and we're moving this to be in the public realm. How do we help get the public ready to be active participants? Because I find that when we do these digital theater presentations, the fact that we're saying that we are inviting you to collaborate with us, you're time traveling to meet Marie Curie in her lab. It's like a historic TED Talk with the living history. It's coming from that discipline. But how do we get people engaged as active participants? Because when they know that, it's very different than, okay, I'm watching a film, I'm going to an exhibit, I'm participating, as opposed to I'm collaborating. And so I'm interested in that. And then part 2, I'm collecting extensive data, and I'd like to share this. We are collecting it for NSF purposes, but I also have additional things that I've been gathering, and I would love to share because I'm finding interesting patterns when you approach things from public history. I find that people relax and they enjoy the experience so much more because there's no other ask. It's about just engagement. So I'm just wondering who's also promoting getting audiences ready to be active members of public history on the public side.
Thank you, Jen. Yes, very good point. A few things there. Maybe Megan, when I was in Louisiana, remembers, but when we were doing some public history project in Louisiana at the beginning, it was open to everybody, and we had these public calls, and it didn't really work. And I think going back to that, I think my weakness, my mistake was to not construct participation enough. And I think that's your point about how do we prep, or how do we prep people to be engaging and not simply attending? And I think you answering the question, it's a process. It's making people part of it. And I think that's one of the role of public history practitioners, is to create frameworks in which people can become actors, because that's not, in many ways, that's not natural. And I'm spending more and more time in constructing framework in which people can have, for example, different involvement. You have people who work and they can only participate in the evening. You have other people who can only participate between 2 and 4. Some people can only do it online. So we are inspired by citizen science here and the division of task. We're trying to provide different types of experience for different types of participants, and working with them to perform small tasks instead of having the whole project together. So some people participate for 1 step, 2 steps. Some people, if they're willing to, take part for the whole project, but we're trying to tailor the different projects to the different participants. And that takes a lot of time in terms of trust. And we work a lot with associations to build trust. So we're not selecting people, but we're working with partners who identify possible participants. Because if not, we're always ending with the same people. Always the usual suspect, the 10, 20 people that always take part in your talk, but we want to go beyond that. So how do we reach people who may have not be super interested, or they may be afraid of joining you on campus? So we work for a long time on trust and working with associations and tailoring the different steps to the different needs of people, and working on-site and analog, on-site and on digital means, so that people from other parts of the country can take part. So it's not a magic recipe, but I think that comes from the fact that we need to build framework to participate. It seems that that's what you're doing too. And for me, that's one of the answers to the lack of participation, but also the poor participation when people don't have time, don't know how to do it, or are not equipped to do the participation. So that's some of the project that we're trying to do, to tailor and to divide the task, to divide the project into tasks that different people can take part into.
Thank you. There's a question from Megan. Would you consider a good public historian someone who is multi-interdisciplinary?
Thank you, Megan. I'm not sure I've qualified to tell who is a good public historian is, but for me, public history is by definition interdisciplinary. Because if you just talk about communication, well, history is not defined as communication, right? Communication has its own principle, methodology, practices, ethics. So if you want to communicate history, it's better done with the consideration of that theory, practice, and participation. If you do public history in museums, it's by definition focus on object, material, culture, and preservation. I don't think you can do public history without interdisciplinarity. The point is that public history is not only about history, right? And that's something that is very challenging for some of us, because we are trained in one discipline, and now we are asked to preserve objects in museums, right? Which is public history. So I think there is a discrepancy between the training and the demand in public history. So it can be solved by collaboration, but the more public history practitioners are aware or understand the approaches, the ethics, the practices of other disciplines, the better they can create those frameworks of participation. So for me, yes, definitely interdisciplinary. Where does that stop? It depends on the project. So there's some public history which is about architecture. If you want to do historic preservation in the US, you better know something about architecture and design, right? If you do, I don't know, if you do guided tour, right, which is one of practice of public history, it's very important to know about urban space, about interaction with space and public speaking. So it really depends the practices of public history, but in a nutshell, yes, it's very interdisciplinary.
Thank you, Thomas. We have another question from Yen. She's asking, are there any recent documentary or media projects exploring public history as a topic subject?
Let me think. So if you consider public history as a topic, I think it's more likely that if there is anything that it has been done in Europe, because I think that the approach in Europe seems to me that people see public history as a topic, something they want to study or something they want to evaluate, which is still this very theoretical approach of public history. So I don't know, there have been books and articles about the history of public history, so history becomes somehow a topic. I don't think there's been a documentary, but maybe we can ask online, social media, if there's been such a thing. One project that we are launching is a conference, but not only for academic, on the long history of public history in Europe, and I think that's exploring not the myth, but the idea that, public history was born in the 1970s in the US, right? And if you focus only on the expression public history, maybe yes, but public historical practices have been in Europe, have been there in Europe for a long time. So what we're trying to explore is, what it was to do oral history, for example, in the 1920s in Europe, or what it was to do reenactment in the late 19th century. Those were forms of public history, so history of public history before the name was used. So that could be an example of a project, but I'm not aware of too many projects that do the history of public history, if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a comment from Barbara Pavlik. Barbara, would you like to open your mic and tell us your comment, please?
Hi, sure. I can paraphrase it so I don't read it. So the question is basically, if we agree that we want to make history more open, more collaborative, more participatory, it seems to me that there should be sort of a self-reflective part here as well. And I'm wondering, as a relative newcomer to the field, in how much do we invest in developing sound methodologies to analyze what's actually, how is public actually remembering, interpreting, referencing, and using the past? And how do our interventions as public historians in terms of projects and these things that we do change this so that we can tune them in and gear them towards making a more difference? So it seems to me that this sort of analytical aspect is a little bit underrepresented, and it could inform this practice in a meaningful way. Yeah, so, but thank you for the talk.
Thank you, Barbara. I will have a two-part answer. One, I completely agree that we need self-reflective practices in public, history in general, in public history maybe even more. So I completely agree, and there are some. I would even argue that there have been a lot of studies on how people remember. This is memory studies. For 40 years, scholars have been studying how people remember the past. So I've been focusing on social groups, commemorations, and that's actually the memory studies field is much bigger than public history. So I would, even though I agree with you that we need to know how people use the past, I would agree that it's not very new, and that's been done before. What is more new is what you propose, is also to evaluate not only the impact, but the relation between public historical practices or projects with how people remember the past. Because we don't have too much data about that. And I think that will be part of what you proposed, a self-reflection about, we are communicating that part of history, but that people remember something different. Is there any correlation? Is there any impact? This would be super useful. But studying how people have been using the past or remembering the past is already present. And I think sometimes people misunderstand public history and memory studies, especially when I talk to some colleagues in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe. When I talk about public history, this is what I'm doing. I'm studying how people remember the fall of the Berlin Wall in fiction, or that's fine. But this, I would argue that it's been done. This field has been done for 40 years. I think public history is also about making history accessible and participatory, taking into account how people remember, yes, but not only studying, because if you only study publics and public groups, you still consider public as a very passive audience, your topic, whereas I would like the publics to be part of the discussion. So I would agree very much with what you said at the end, including this public understanding of the past into a broader discussion on doing public history in the public space.
Thank you. Yeah, that's been my experience as well in teaching, that memory studies and public history it's hard to explain what is what to students sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to read a question from Goki. He is at midnight in his location, so he can't speak out loud, so I'm going to read it for him. I have a question about the use of the term history From your point of view, do you see public history and public humanities as a similar field or something different? I understand that public history should deal with topics in the broad field of history and requires historians. However, from my view, it sounds very similar with the broader term public humanities, whether or not the study research project includes historians. How do you see public history and public humanities in the same or different field?
Thank you, Gaki. They connect, but they're also different. Public history is history, public humanities is humanities. For example, literacy studies, language and ethics, humanities. Is that history? Not that much, right? So I would say that public history may belong to a broader field of public humanities. And you have public humanities centers at Brown University in the US or in Venice, Ca' Foscari, they have digital public humanities, and that includes public history. But public history is part of public humanities. And sometimes very difficult to make, an historian, linguistic expert, art expert in the same room, and they talk about public humanities, and sometimes they disagree. The relation is public, right? So how do you make your field public, or how do you include the public? How do you reflect about public in your discipline? I think this is where they connect. So yes, they connect. I would say that public history is more limited than public humanities, which is a broader field, like digital humanities. You have digital humanities and digital history. They relate, but they're also different because digital history is way more specific.
Thank you. And we have also a question from Jamie Simmons. Jamie, would you like to open your mic and ask the question?
Sure, thanks. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the project-based learning that you mentioned with your students, and particularly what sort of projects have worked well or not worked in the classroom, and then also in terms of community work or sharing authority with various publics, how that's worked to develop the relationships long-term when you're stuck with a semester for a class, and how you build relationships with the community around you and keep them ethical as well. I'd love to hear more about. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jamie. So what has worked and what has not worked? What has worked, again, depends the projects and depends the class, because every student is different. So it's hard to generalize, right? My feeling is that they struggle with teamwork. Because they're not used to working in groups, and that because working in groups is difficult and brings skills that we may not have or may be willing to have, right? Consensus, compromises, working together for a better good. Those are important skills that we don't teach too much. And a lot of very good students are also very independent, and they don't really like working with people who are not as good as they are, if you know where I'm leading. So working in teams, and I always want them to work in teams, is challenging. What is also challenging is what you mentioned in your second question, the different management of time. You have the student time, you have the instructor time, you have the project partner time, you have the administrative time. And those sometimes relate, sometimes conflict. And this is something that students are sometimes very much challenged by. When they want an answer, in the day, and your partner cannot, or if your partner wants something for July, and they say, well, my finals are in June. So this is extremely difficult to prepare project-based learning. I think, again, it takes some building time. I mean, project-based learning should be prepared not a month before, not 6 months before, but maybe sometime 1 year before, so that you prep your partner so that they know what to expect, what they can ask and cannot ask. So it's a lot of prep. And that connects to your second question. like sustainability, usually you have partners you work with on several semesters. For students, it's a one-time thing, but for the other students, I mean, it's one-time thing for students, but for the partner, it's a multiple activities process. So this is something part of the trust building experience. You work with partners, the same partners, and you try to make understand that the students can do something for one semester, and the following students will do something else, which is not collecting. It may be interpreting, or it may be communicating. This is something that can be done, but for some partner it doesn't work because they don't have the funding for a year. They have funding for 3 months, so that's quite challenging. So again, no magical solution, but working ahead to build participation, like you build participation with the publics and the member of the public. You do the same with partners, and they also can teach you how to teach. That's something I like to do, to share my syllabus with my partners, even at the beginning, so that's it. Well, that doesn't work. So they have a voice in how the class is taught, and can help me better understand the agenda, the calendar, and have more room for the student interaction.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Thomas. I don't know if there's a last comment or a last question, or if Thomas, if you want to say something, you want to add something.
Well, I'd like to thank you. And unless there's a question, I heard something.
No, everybody's thanking you.
So I'm thanking you in the Explorers, the network of Explorers. Again, I think you do a great job. Keep this network alive, because it brings people together who are in different countries, different approaches, different expertise, different experience. And I think that's what makes international public history wonderful. And I would just share that tonight you're doing another project or another presentation about ChatGPT and artificial intelligence and history and teaching, which is a very timely discussion. So I would encourage all of you to, if you can, attend the talk, which is starting in 90 minutes, I believe. Yes.
Thank you, Thomas, for that. Yes, the History Communication Institute with Jason Steinhauer reached out to the Explorers. We're doing a joint event, which is like kind of interesting also for Explorers. We have a lot of people registered. We encourage you. It's going to be great. But I also want to thank you all for coming to this first event of the Explorers of 2023. It was really great. Thomas, thank you very much. I also want to invite you to follow us on Instagram and in Twitter. That has also been kind of a new project Explorers has been trying to do, but it's hard, as Thomas says. It's a process. And our next Explorers event will be on February 15. We're going to talk about Latinx communities and Planned Parenthood, a research done by a German scholar. So yes, we're bringing together people from all over the world, and we hope to see you there. And thank you very much.
Thank you.